Hello and welcome to Original Soundchat, where video game music is a work of art. On each episode, it's our goal to help you learn about two soundtracks from the world of games, as well as the people, stories, and critical tracks behind them. My name is DeVader.
And I'm Peter Spezia. We're brought to you by Anonymous Dinosaur and Rhymes with Asia. It's time to appreciate great OSTs and the games they come from, without getting too bogged down in music theory. Joe, what are this week's games?
Up first is 2019's Heaven's Vault, an adventure through the rivers of a nebula to solve mysteries and decipher a dead language.
Following that is the insurmountable task of equaling a legendary Super Nintendo game, when it turns out the only solution is changing camera perspectives entirely, in one of the finest franchise transitions from 2D to 3D, 2002's Metroid Prime. Joe, congrats, we're microphone buddies, yeah!
Yeah, I got the nicer microphone, even if it's causing issues now for some reason that I don't understand and we don't understand, but it's fine, everything's fine.
Got it to work, it's, tech issues, it happens.
Yeah, this is the first thing that I've recorded with this microphone. It's not the first thing that I've used it for. We did that charity stream and I had it the whole time for that. Raised $400 for the Video Game History Foundation. That's pretty cool.
And Mario's dead. That's what we got out of it.
Rest in peace, Mario.
In the meantime, these two games this week, possible themes here. There's space ruins. There are female protagonists. Researching lost civilizations. It's possible. I mean, the two games themselves, very different, but at least there are those threads between them.
Yeah, couldn't be more different, these two games, honestly. Because one is about shooting, and the other has zero shooting whatsoever.
In the meantime, Joe, how are you doing? What are you playing?
I actually played a good amount in the past week. I'm still working my way through Eye of the Somnium Files, very slowly. It's kind of just become my before bedtime game. It's good. I'm enjoying it. But I played my first two 2021 games this week. The first one is a game called Adios. It is about an hour long, and you should play it. You specifically, Peter. I think you would dig it a lot. It's a narrative game. Only goes for about an hour. I believe it's only on PC, and it's just really, really well done. And I had a great time with it. And then I played a puzzle game that is the PS5 free game this month, or was last month, I guess. It's April now. What am I talking about? Called Maquette, which is a very, very interesting game. It's a puzzle game that deals with recursion. So you're standing in like this dome with these four areas that you can go to on the different sides. And inside of that dome is a smaller version of that dome with all of the doors. And if you look out past your like regular sized dome, you'll see a giant one. And so it's a lot of puzzles that deal with that. Like, the game will give you a key and you'll have to go into the small thing and drop the key in there, at which point a giant key will fall into the regular one. And it's a very, very neat game. It has a little plot narrative of like this couple, sort of very Florence-like, this couple getting together and then growing apart and all that. Yeah, it's pretty neat, and I would recommend if you have PlayStation Plus and you grabbed it, you should give it a shot.
Well, I did that certainly last month, and that's good to know about Adios. I'm now juggling which game I want to progress to play past Hades. Between Doom 2016, there's also a little game on Apple Arcade that we'll talk about very shortly that's also vying for my attention. Disco Elysium, The Final Cut. There's also It Takes Two. It's a pretty good time for games right now. I just got to decide what direction I want to go in.
Yes, especially last Friday. There's a lot of stuff that came out all at once.
Well, we got to enjoy it while we can for 2021 because a lot of things are getting delayed. In the meantime, let's talk about some composer follow-up news. We've talked about many composers on this show, but they're still doing great things, making new things. Their old work gets repurposed in new ways. So let's talk about some of that in relation to the game headlines of the past week. Bravely Default and Bravely Default 2 now have their soundtrack streaming on Spotify. Yay!
Yay! I actually haven't put them on the playlist yet. I should get on that, actually.
Absolutely. Revo's work there should be on our big Spotify playlist since we covered that game on the show previously.
Meanwhile, Bear McCreary may be composing for the game Forspoken. Maybe. Seems very likely. It just hasn't been 100% confirmed yet, but that appears to be the case.
Yeah, it was the lead actress for that game who retweeted something, giving a thumbs up, some sort of tacit approval where suggested that Bear McCreary was doing the music for the game. This is the Square Enix game that was formerly known as Project Athia, the PS5 current exclusive, I guess. That's going to be shown more later in the year, but they had a Presents where they also showed the Life is Strange True Colors game and the Life is Strange Remastered, but they also showed this little trailer. So yeah, more work for Bear McCreary, always a good thing. Lena Raine is also very busy. Not only does she have Chicory coming out hopefully soon, here in spring 2021, but she's also composing for a fishing RPG called Moonglow Bay, which is also supposedly out spring 2021.
Yeah, it's like this voxel style fishing RPG, and I was not aware of it until Lena Raine mentioned that she was doing the music, so I probably would have been slightly interested in it before that, but this just cements it. I'm super interested now. Meanwhile, as you alluded to earlier, Fantasian is now available on Apple Arcade. That's the new RPG from Mistwalker and specifically Sakaguchi, the original creator of Final Fantasy, but also the soundtrack is done by Nobuo Uematsu, and the bits and pieces I have heard are great.
Yeah, it's the diorama that was carefully constructed in the real world, and then they kind of brought it into the game world. I've got it downloaded on my phone. I'm ready to go. I'm excited to give this a shot, and it might be Uematsu's last big composing project, so also exciting but wistfully sad in that regard.
I don't have an Apple device, so I can't play it. Hopefully it comes to other stuff, but who knows. But I have heard that it is very good. Alright, so with that, we're going to go ahead and jump into the first game, and it is Heaven's Vault, which some people listening might have never heard of this game, and that would be understandable. It was originally released for PlayStation 4 and PC on April 16th, 2019, but it also recently released for Switch, which is how I played it. That was on January 28th, 2021. It was developed and published by Inkle, who is a UK-based studio whose previous works include Sorcery, 80 Days, and a 2020 game called Pendragon, or Pendragon. I've never quite known how to pronounce that.
Pendragon?
Pendragon? It could be that. Who knows? The English are silly. I shouldn't say that. We have a friend who's over there.
We also speak English, for the record.
This is true. So, Inkle is also apparently responsible for multiple interactive fiction writing tools, such as Inkle Writer, which I've actually heard that name before, though apparently that service has since been shut down. But they also have two services called Ink and Inky, and those have been used by multiple other developers to aid in development. Most notably, the Wikipedia article for the studio mentioned that the Banner Saga was made partially with Inkle Writer. So, Heaven's Vault specifically is an adventure game in a sci-fi setting, and it is entirely about exploration and discovery. There is no action. It's pretty much just a laid back, go at your own pace, go in and investigate stuff game. There's really not much more to it than that. You take control of Alia Elazra, an archaeologist working under the University of Iox. So this game, I think, has one of the most unique sci-fi settings I've ever seen, because unlike most space sci-fi games where it's like, here's the solar system or the galaxy and all that, this game takes place in a nebula where there are various quote-unquote moons, which are basically just chunks of rock that happen to have a breathable atmosphere on them, and people live on those moons. And joining Aaliyah, much to her chagrin, is her robot assistant 6, who is so named because he is the 6th robot that she has been given. 1 through 5 mysteriously were destroyed. She just sort of loses robots, I guess, is the way she puts it. And 6 himself was actually unearthed beneath the university because it turns out that the old Ioxian Empire had ordered the robots to be encased in the earth below, which is a little interesting. This game also has dialogue, so during conversations, dialogue options will be presented to the player, and you'll decide how Aaliyah interacts with people, or how she feels about people, or even how she feels about specific places. Fun fact, in my opinion, this is a very impressive thing. Aaliyah's the first character I've ever played where it feels correct to sort of play her to be mean to certain people. Because we've talked about this in like Mass Effect and stuff, where it's like, I have social anxiety, I don't want to be mean, I don't want to be the mean person.
Mm-hmm.
But with Aaliyah, it makes sense. 100%. It's a really interesting and well done character, I feel like. So, you might remember that earlier I mentioned the Ioxian Empire. Well, they were once the seat of power throughout the entire nebula, but 300 years prior to this game's story, the Empire fell, and nobody knows why. Just sort of disappeared. It's kind of the same as the Roman Empire, but we obviously know why the Roman Empire fell. The Ioxian Empire wrote in a now forgotten language of glyphs that is referred to as ancient, and Aaliyah has dedicated her life to deciphering it. As you explore the nebula, you will find various structures or items with ancient engraved onto them, at which point you will be able to attempt to guess the word's meaning, and you gotta use context clues, as well as markings that could be shared with other words to give you a hint as what that word might be. And as you continue to find phrases to translate, Aaliyah will gradually become more and more confident in her translations, or she will realize that those translations were wrong and take another guess. And according to the devs, by the way, there are over 1,000 words to be discovered and translated in the game. And the main inspiration behind these glyphs were ancient Egyptian, which, if you've looked at the glyphs in the game, that checks out, and Chinese. So I mentioned earlier that this game takes place in a nebula, which is a very unique setting for space sci-fi. And that means that the ships work a little bit differently in this world. See, Aaliyah's ship, the Nightingale, doesn't really work like what you'd think a spaceship would work as. It's actually more like a sailboat, because the nebula has quote-unquote rivers that are made up of like ice crystals and all sorts of like debris and dust and different materials that basically let them flow like water, essentially. And so you travel these rivers in this sail-bound boat. And honestly, I think it's the least good part of the game, the sailing, but it's really pretty. It's really pretty, and that sort of cuts down on how super bored I was with the sailing. Anyways, sorry, there's a lot to explain about this game, because it's not really a game I can compare to anything else. So, the story of this game, when Aaliyah is summoned back to the University of Iox by her adoptive mother and the head of the university, she's given a robot that she names 6, and is asked to investigate the disappearance of a roboticist named Janiki Remba. Before he had vanished, he had sent the university a brooch that may have potentially belonged to an emperor of the Ioxian Empire. Despite her reluctance to her robotic partner and no real interest in Remba's plight, Aaliyah and 6 begin an investigation that will take her throughout the nebula, from the lush green moon of Maersi to her poverty-ridden homeworld of Elbereth, and the many abandoned and ancient moons between. The pair begin to uncover a mystery that may decide the fate of the entire nebula, and may explain the ultimate fate of the ancient empire. So the questions become, Can Aaliyah and Six learn what became of Renba? Can Aaliyah translate the ancient language enough to learn the Empire's fate, or even of the world before the Empire existed? And what exactly is Heaven's Vault? Peter, this is where I will ask you, what are your experiences with Heaven's Vault?
The only place I had heard of it was when you were talking about playing it on this show. I've still had no idea what it was. So looking up a story trailer for this game, it's interesting to see the visual style for it since I knew so little about it. It seems like the world that you travel in generally runs at a normal frame rate, but the animation of your character, of Aaliyah, is like really, it's not choppy, but there's like only so many keyframes in the animation. It's a really distinct style, and like the art is gorgeous. Of course, I can imagine how sailing is really neat. I'm just tickled how the language is called Ancient.
Yeah, that it's just called Ancient. They don't really have it's not even Ancient Ioxian or anything, it's just Ancient. That distinct art style is one of the things that first drew me to the game, because it is 2D characters, like hand-drawn 2D characters in a 3D world, which we'll get into why that's the case in a bit. It was also just like the concept sounded really neat, and I wanted to see if they could land it, and honestly, I really think they do. I think the concept of a game built entirely around trying to like decipher a language that nobody reads anymore, I think is really, really cool. And the story is a lot of fun. And honestly, for a long while, it was my play a little bit before I go to bed game, because it's very laid back, very pretty, very well put together. And I definitely recommend for anybody that has any interest in like archaeology or linguistics, or even just sci-fi with an interesting twist to it, you should check out Heaven's Vault. It's very good. So, let's talk about what it took to bring this game to life. So, according to developers, the language design was actually the hardest thing they have ever done in terms of design throughout their entire career. That sounds about right. And they were bouncing between multiple different versions of what Ancient would be, but most of them were either way too easy and were holding the hands of players to a point where, like, why would you bother trying to do the puzzle anymore? It's not even hard. But then they also had ones that were way too hard to decipher, and playtesters just couldn't do anything. So eventually, they were able to settle on something that felt right, and right as they felt that, they put a freeze on it and said nobody is allowed to touch the language now. It's done. Some of the translation mechanic was actually inspired by various members of the studio learning various languages at that time, and they realized that they were finally on the right track when one of the devs saw 2 words in Ancient and could instantly tell they were related, giving them the realistic translation feeling they had been going for. The mechanic actually started as more of a cryptographic puzzle. I don't 100% know what that would have looked like, but eventually it just kind of turned into linguistics, and I think that was probably the right move, because again, it's the most interesting part of the game, like by far. The narrative director of this game's name is John Ingold, and he told a story about when he was talking to his wife about the position of Aaliyah in her world, where she was born on the poor moon of Elbereth, and then eventually brought up into the rich moon of Iox. So she kind of just exists in between. A lot of the people on Iox don't really see her as an equal. People on Elbereth don't really trust her because she's now an Ioxian to them. And his wife apparently brought to his attention that he had just accidentally written himself as the main character of this game, because he was born in Manchester and ended up attending Cambridge, which I guess those are equivalent. Cambridge, I know. I've never heard Manchester as like the poor area. I don't know enough about UK stuff to be able to comment on that. Also, though, a quick side note, apparently I found in another interview that John Ingold's father is a man named Tim Ingold, and he's apparently a well-known name in the world of archaeology. Like, he wrote a book, and archaeologists just sort of know him. So I found that kind of neat as well. I imagine that had some influence on the game's narrative and stuff. And speaking of archaeology, they kind of wanted one of their major goals to be building a narrative around the field of archaeology, because archaeology's kind of become a little more controversial in recent years. Archaeology, as we know it, is mainly just a bunch of white people going to non-white countries and taking their ancient stuff and putting them into a museum, which, you know, fair to be mad at people for that. So they wanted to sort of find this natural way to make the player able to make this choice of, like, is it Aaliyah's responsibility to, like, take these things and preserve them? Is it even her right to preserve these things? They don't belong to her, etc., etc. The game, like you mentioned, has a very distinct art style, though, with hand-drawn 2D characters residing in the 3D world, like I said. And it is this way apparently because this game started as a 2D graphic novel.
That makes sense.
And then when they went to make the 3D backgrounds to use as sets, quote unquote, they realized that they really actually kind of loved being able to see the characters from different angles. And so they got so excited by this idea that Heaven's Vault became a full 3D game. They also went with this art style because, in their opinion, and correctly, they were worried that 3D models of people might get a little uncanny valley at certain points, because that's what happens when you try to make 3D models of people and you don't really have the budget to do that. They look creepy and scary. So they just decided that 2D was easier, and also they figured it would be more expressive in the long run, and I think they were right. The characters in this game are very expressive. So, upon release, this game was reviewed overall pretty well. On Metacritic, it currently has a 76 on PC, 71 on PS4, and 77 on Switch. I am part of the reason it has a 77 on Switch, because I gave it an 8. Heaven's Vault was nominated for a good amount of awards, but it only won one of them. It was nominated for Best Role-Playing Game at IGDA, PC Game of the Year at the Golden Joysticks, Best Writing in a Video Game at the Writers Guild of Great Britain Awards, the Off-Broadway Award for Best Indie Game at the New York Game Awards, Gameplay Innovation of the Year and Narrative Innovation of the Year at the MCV Develop Awards, and Best British Game at the BAFTAs. It did, however, win Excellence in Narrative at IGF. So, not really an awards darling, but it was nominated for quite a bit in 2019, which is on its own, pretty impressive. So, the person behind the music for this game is Laurence Chapman. He was born in Cambridge in 1985, and he was apparently inspired to begin composing after hearing the film scores of Jerry Goldsmith, who, even if you don't recognize the name, you have heard his music before. He was the composer for the original Planet of the Apes, Alien, Star Trek the Motion Picture, Rudy, Mulan, The Mummy, and even more than that. It's really funny to me that Rudy and Mulan were scored by the same dude.
Yeah, right.
I don't know why that's funny, but it is. So he started composing music for his high school orchestra, as well as for jazz groups that he was a member of, and then he moved into writing music for youth orchestras around his area. After that, Chapman attended Southampton University, and one of his projects while there was to write the score for a play called Spring Awakening that required him to rearrange various 60s pop songs to fit an eerie setting. I don't know what that means, but I'm very intrigued. After this, he went on to write multiple other theater scores, and then in the late 2000s, when he was living in London, he arranged and performed the piano parts for 2 of Ed Sheeran's EPs, and I could not find which ones they were in detail. But 2 of Ed Sheeran's EPs have piano by Laurence Chapman. That's pretty neat. He was also a music assistant for Law & Order UK, which was not a show I was aware existed, but also I'm not surprised. And this was in 2013, and he's since worked on the music for several other British TV series. And of course, he began working with Inkle in 2014, putting together the score for their game 80 Days, and they were so impressed that they asked him back to redo the score of the Sorcery games, including having him write a full replacement for the game's main theme. The bio on his website lists several influences, stuff from Bach, Beethoven, Stravinsky, then more modern things like John Williams and, of course, Jerry Goldsmith, and, most notably for us, Harry Gregson Williams.
Hey.
And you can follow Laurence Chapman on Twitter at Composer Chapman. So, in terms of discography, he's really only composed music for the Inkle stuff. So, Sorcery, he did the music for Heaven's Vault and Pendragon. But he also did a game called Ski 3, and I don't know what that is, but it's a great name. A little play off of Ski Free. But he is also credited as the orchestrator/transcriber on Total War Warhammer 2, Total War Thrones of Britannia, and Total War 3 Kingdoms. So he has worked on the Total War series quite a bit in his career, and also just a ton of British documentaries and TV shows, and even a couple of films, but I didn't really recognize any of the names, so we'll just leave it at that. In terms of historical development research, though, the original plan that he had was for a more usual synthy space sound, because, you're told you're working on a space game. Synths. You need synths when you're in space. And the final product does have some synths, but as the project went on, he kind of decided that the game needed a more intimate sound, is how he put it. Like I said, while synths are technically in the final soundtrack, they're not really the focus ever. Instead, this soundtrack features the vocal work of Haley Glennie Smith in one of the pieces, which we'll talk about in a bit, but also really has a lot of work done on strings by the Leos Strings. And of course, any piano you hear on the soundtrack, which is also a big part of it, is Chapman himself. And he was apparently given a huge amount of freedom to experiment, and this really allowed him to take as much time as he needed to get things right. This is the first time that I have done a game that is on a bunch of services, but not on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
It's odd in that way, but you can purchase the Heaven's Vault soundtrack on Bandcamp, Apple Music, Steam, and Amazon Music, and you should definitely go do that because it's very, very good. But why take my word for it when I can just shove the songs into your ears 30 seconds at a time? So let's jump into the 5 critical tracks. And we're going to start with critical track number 1, An Ancient Language, main theme. So this is the title screen of Heaven's Vault, and it's just a hauntingly gorgeous cello performance. Like, it's really, really good, and oh man. One of the things that's really developed in me over the course of doing this show is I think I have a much higher appreciation of the cello.
Yeah, the range on cello is amazing to hit those low lows, those high highs, but I think it's also the accompaniment that goes with it, with the piano, with the supporting strings behind it, that just makes it sound as good as it does. But yeah, for the cello to shine here in a sense with solo cello makes me think a little bit about Journey.
Yeah, Journey is absolutely where I went to with like Tina Guo and all that stuff. It's a nice song, but I don't think it actually plays in the narrative at any point. But I mean, it's the main theme of the game, and it's gorgeous, so why not bring it?
Mm-hmm.
But a song that does play in the game is critical track number 2, Under the Eye of Kibenya. This is actually my favorite song on the soundtrack, and I believe it plays on the marshy, lush moon of Maersi. I don't know for sure because actually trying to find specific scenes from this game is very difficult because it's a non-linear experience, so you have to it would take a lot of work to go figure out exactly where these play. But I think it's Maersi, which is one of the first locations you visit. Kibenya is in reference to a statue that you find in the village on Maersi of a being that Aaliyah eventually determines to be a water or river goddess. And I think this song just has this really interesting sense of wonder and kind of has an almost joyful, serene feeling to it, which really fits Aaliyah's reaction to visiting it, or at least my Aaliyah's reaction to visiting it, which was, oh my god, there's so much water. Everybody could drink and be fine forever. There's so much water, because she grew up on a poor desert moon where there was very little water. So every time water showed up, Aaliyah's just kind of like, if there was a way to get this to Elbereth, oh, that would be amazing. But she cannot. But yeah, I adore this song. I think it is my favorite harmony at the very least. And man, those strings are just putting in the work. The Leo strings. Good job.
Yeah, definitely more violin with the high pitched in this one. But you can tell it's water, right? Because it's more positive, it's more free flowing, and it's nice when the music reflects that. I get the feeling of this starts to go into Studio Ghibli territory and the work of Joe Hisaishi a little bit. Not with the big, triumphant trumpet fanfares or whatever, but the simple melody with the orchestra and the small sort of intimate string feeling. I kind of get that vibe. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think I kind of can hear it. Yeah. I mean, I would be shocked if multiple composers don't have at least a little bit of Ghibli in their influence list there. They might not know Joe Hisaishi by name, but they've seen Spirited Away. They've seen Totoro or something. They've seen at least one of those movies. So I don't know, maybe. But I can absolutely hear what you're saying. Critical track number 3 is Before the Fall. This is, I think, a close second for my favorite song in the game. I believe, based on context clues, this song plays when you discover a garden that seemingly belonged to the Emperor of Iox before the Empire had collapsed, hence the name Before the Fall. And I think this is another incredible strings piece, but this one also brings Chapman's piano playing a little bit more into the foreground and just, kills it, honestly. This is such a good piece.
Again, like you're describing these things, and to someone who hasn't played the game, like it highlights it perfectly. This song is so lush, and it shows that interplay really well between the strings and the piano. So when it is highlighting something that was a time, or at least shows something from before the Empire's fall and how gorgeous and beautiful it was, that fits perfectly.
Yeah, it's a very nice piece, and you can feel the serenity, I feel like. Which is fitting because of what that garden ends up being, which you discover that its purpose. But I will leave that to people who want to try to play the game. So we'll just move on to critical track number 4, probably the song you're going to hear more than any other song in the entire game. This is The Nebula. So this 8-minute monster of a piece plays when you're sailing on the rivers. It features vocals, as you can hear in the clip, by Haley Glennie Smith, and these vocals were actually included to give the nebulas a more, quote, otherworldly feeling, which nailed it, absolutely, 100%. And it's just a really, really serene piece, and I think that just makes it absolutely perfect for the really beautiful and peaceful, serene rivers of the nebula, even when the rivers get fast, because there are rapids, but it just, it hits just right for that setting.
The Wind Waker's The Great Sea, this is not. It definitely feels like you're floating on a dream, and yeah, you want that otherworldly feeling, you get kind of haunting vocals like this. I nailed it perfectly. But yeah, a totally different vibe than other games with sailing in it.
Oh yeah. But also, visually it's way different from anything you're going to play with sailing.
Yeah.
So let's get into the final critical track. Number 5 is Heaven's Vault. So this, I believe this song plays as you are walking up to what you believe to be Heaven's Vault. It's got this growing sense of finality to it, I feel like, and that really helps it feel like you're coming to the culmination of it all. You're reaching the climax. You're finally going to answer the questions you've been asking this whole time. What is Heaven's Vault? Where is Heaven's Vault? Is Heaven's Vault even actually a thing that exists? And this song just gives the feeling of the pieces are falling into place and you've finally done it.
Yeah, it's absolutely what this is. For the small scale of this orchestra, this little set that they've pulled together here for the instrumentalists, this is as big as the sound gets, I would imagine. It's not, big Hollywood orchestra, bombastic percussion, whatever, but for the pieces they've assembled together, this is the climax. You totally feel that.
And it makes sense that it's, it doesn't feel like the big Hollywood orchestra, because one of the things that Chapman was kind of going for was he wanted it to be a more intimate soundtrack for the adventure. And I think he nailed that as well. So, for tracks on the cutting room floor, I got 2. The first one is The Children of Elbereth. So, as I mentioned earlier, Elbereth is the moon that Aaliyah grew up on, and it's a really rough place. Honestly, it has a lot of vibes of Mos Eisley from Star Wars, like very close to that. Obviously, no aliens, they're all humans. All the characters are either human or a robot. This song kind of carries that sort of rough feeling of how not great of a place Elbereth is, yet it also just sort of has this air of fondness, because Aaliyah still does consider Elbereth to be her home. Like, yeah, she works for IOX and all that, but Elbereth is where her friends live. It's where she grew up. It's home, regardless of how bad it is. And I think this song really, really, really drives that home.
You can definitely tell with the minor key here, right? Like there's something unsettling here, like all is not well, and the key is chosen perfectly for it.
As for the second song on the cutting room floor, I had to get in a song that was just completely focused on Chapman's piano, and we get that in Fantasia on One Good Moon. Just piano, man. Just piano. It's real, real good. I love the piano, you know me.
Gorgeous. Gotta shout out a solo piano piece when you've got it.
Hell yeah, you do. So what will I never forget about the game? I think Heaven's Vault has one of the most unique and interesting settings of any sci-fi game I've ever played. I wouldn't say it is the greatest game in the world. I think it does have a couple of problems. Like I said, I think sailing is kind of boring and you do it a lot. But otherwise, like, the characters are fun, the writing is good, and just the concept is very, very intriguing. It's an interesting game.
I am interested to learn more about it, perhaps even play it. Thank you for opening my eyes to it.
Yeah, and I hope I do that for multiple others out there, because you should play this game. If anything that I've been talking about for the past 45 minutes has caught your ear at all, you should be looking into this game. So, in terms of a transition, I couldn't find any cover or remix of anything on this soundtrack, which, not surprising. I'm not going to pretend that I'm surprised by that. So, I just grabbed the last track on the soundtrack, which is just a rearrangement of An Ancient Language with a focus on cello and piano. So please enjoy that. We will be right back.
So in a game about a female protagonist looking into lost space civilizations, what game does that bring to mind? Oh, the Metroid series. And so finally, we are talking about Metroid Prime on this show. Thank goodness, because we highlighted Super Metroid on Original Soundchat on episode 57, where we covered composer Kenji Yamamoto. And now on episode 115, almost double that number of episodes, we bring the other universally regarded Metroid game. So Metroid Prime was released in North America on November 17th, 2002 for Nintendo GameCube. Japan would get the game on February 28th, 2003, Europe on March 21st, 2003, and Australia on April 3rd. The game would come to Japan on Nintendo Wii as a new Play Control standalone title on February 19th, 2009. But the rest of the world could play the game on Wii as part of the Metroid Prime trilogy, starting with North America on August 21st, 2009. This trilogy would eventually become available for download from the Wii U's eShop on January 29th, 2015. Can you play it on anything newer? Not yet. So you may have to dig out some old Nintendo consoles if you want to play Metroid Prime. The game is developed by Retro Studios and Nintendo in a joint collaborative effort, and it is published by Nintendo. Metroid Prime is a first-person Metroidvania action-adventure game. We've thrown out the word Metroidvania before on past episodes. Basically, think it's a game with a big map that can be explored in certain ways by collecting specific items and exploring secrets. So the gameplay of Metroid Prime involves exploring a planet with multiple environment types, collecting suit upgrades, beam weapons, ability visors, solving puzzles to reveal secrets, platform jumping, and shooting foes with the help of a lock-on mechanism that allows for circle strafing while you're staying aimed at an enemy. So the plot of Metroid Prime involves you're after the events of the original Metroid game, but you're before the events of the Metroid 2 game on Game Boy, where bounty hunter Samus Aran intercepts a distress signal from the space pirate frigate Orpheon, where the crew there have been slaughtered by the pirates' own genetically modified experimental subjects. While Samus is escaping the frigate, she encounters a cybernetic version of her nemesis, Ridley, called Meta Ridley. During her escape, an explosion damages Samus's suit, causing most of her abilities to malfunction. She chases Meta Ridley in her gunship to the nearby planet of Tallon IV, where she discovers the Chozo ruins, the remains of the Chozo civilization. As she explores the ruins, she learns that the Chozo on the planet had been killed by the toxic element known as Phazon from a meteor that impacted Tallon IV many years ago. However, the Phazon threat remains at large, and the space pirates are continuing their research on the energy-siphoning beings known as Metroids. Can Samus retrieve her lost powers on Tallon IV, defeat the space pirates and their leader, Meta Ridley, collect all 12 Chozo artifacts to access the meteor impact site, and stop the Phazon threat? Joe, here's where I'll ask you, what are our experiences with Metroid Prime?
I have never played Metroid Prime, any of them. So when we get to it for Smasherpieces, potentially sometime in 2021, that'll be my first time. But yeah, I didn't have a GameCube, and I didn't end up getting Trilogy, but I own Trilogy on Wii U because my roommate Ben bought it, I think. So, I mean, I have access to it. I'm just waiting for us to hit it for the show now.
And I am so excited for you to experience it on Smasherpieces. Though it'll be interesting to see if you're playing the Trilogy version, you'll have the Wii point control, which is fun. You have the lock on, but then you get to be a little more specific in your aiming, like going for headshots or whatever, as opposed to just GameCube controls where you're locking on and just firing pretty indiscriminately. So Metroid Prime is up there in one of my favorite games of all time. I think I've played the game 4 to 5 times. It's a stone cold classic, honestly, especially if you, like I did, started your console days with a Nintendo GameCube. It was a must. And so adored Metroid Prime, the first Metroid game I played, so I guess that also speaks to something where I'm not like, bah, it's not like Super Metroid. I don't have that kind of nostalgia to work with, if you will. But Metroid Prime is fantastic. The sequels, also good, but there's something about that first one that is just special.
It's another one of those games that is regularly on the best games of all time lists.
Yeah, absolutely. It's deservingly up there, and yeah, I'm so excited when you guys get to play that for your other podcast, Smasherpieces. So learning about Metroid Prime as someone who's played it so many times and knows quite a bit about it was fascinating because I got to learn more new things about it, and it's just, more reasons why I love doing this show with you, Joe. It's just you learn great things. We get to pass it on to people who may not know these things as well. So when you think of Super Metroid on Super Nintendo, another one of the all-time classic great games, especially in Nintendo history, you think, well, was there a Metroid game on Nintendo 64? We've talked about so many Nintendo 64 games and the Nintendo 64 DD. No, not even a Metroid game in development that made it so far. This was chalked up to several reasons. First of all, it was quoted that Nintendo, quote, couldn't come out with any concrete ideas. There was another quote that mentioned how they could not imagine how the N64 controller could be used to control Samus for a Nintendo 64 Metroid game.
Funnily enough, that's a question we all should have asked about the N64 and all of the games.
Fair. I mean, that joystick was pretty unique to start out with, and I guess was the beginning of where all these joysticks would come from in the future. But another one that was interesting to note was that Nintendo made offers to different developers like, hey, would you like to take a stab at developing a Metroid game for Nintendo 64? And eventually most of these developers were just like, we just wouldn't be able to equal Super Metroid.
Yeah, it's an incredible amount of pressure.
Yeah, like that's just too high of a task for us to live up to with your IP. So what ended up happening? Well, here comes Retro Studios, which was established as a collaboration between Nintendo and Jeff Spangenberg of Iguana Entertainment. Iguana Entertainment did a lot of the Nintendo 64 sports games at the time, and they eventually became Acclaim Studios Austin. And Retro Studios was established with the goal of creating more mature games for Nintendo GameCube. So after they established its offices in Austin, Texas in 1999, Retro Studios had 4 GameCube projects in the pipeline. When Nintendo's Shigeru Miyamoto visited Retro in 2000, he suggested a new Metroid game after seeing their prototype first-person shooter engine. In 2000 and early 2001, 4 games in development at Retro were canceled, including an RPG called Raven Blade, leaving Metroid Prime, or at least what would become Metroid Prime, as the only game in development. So, in this collaboration, Nintendo created the music, Retro handled the art and engineering, and both teams worked on the overall design. They communicated through emails, telephone conferences, and personal gatherings, which in the early 2000s must be very different as far as technology capability compared to a year of Zoom calls and the like today. Prime was originally intended to be a third-person game. But after the camera troubles that the developer Rare discovered with Nintendo 64's 1999 third-person shooter game Jet Force Gemini, Shigeru Miyamoto intervened and suggested the change to a first-person game.
Oh man, I did not expect Jet Force Gemini to show up in this story.
Right? So with this change that Miyamoto said, hey, let's do a first-person game because I, as the producer at Nintendo, say so. This scrapped all development progress thus far. But at least the team at Retro, they just didn't want to make a typical first-person shooter, though. It was starting to become the popular thing at the time. You think Halo in 2001 was going to be the big breakthrough. They wanted to break down the genre conventions of a first-person shooter and first and foremost make a fun Metroid game. And what's part of a Metroid game? Well, Samus turning into her morph ball form. And this really wouldn't work in first person. They had to make a third person camera specifically for Samus moving around in this morph ball form, which was a struggle in itself. They found it very difficult. Even Miyamoto was like, look, if you can't make this work, you don't make the game at all. Like, you need the morph ball in a Metroid game.
Yeah.
And so they doubled down and they made it work, going from first person to a third person camera just for these modes. So the first appearance of Metroid for GameCube was a 10-second video at Nintendo Space World in August 2000. Nintendo confirmed the project in February 2001, citing that it would be a first-person adventure instead of a first-person shooter. The game would eventually be given the title of Metroid Prime in May 2001 with its appearance at the Electronic Entertainment Expo. Unfortunately, the game suffered some nasty crunch by the end of it, and it leaves a lot of Retro Studios employees at the time not wanting to talk about their experiences. Apparently, during the last 9 months of development, Retro's staff worked 80 to 100 hour weeks to reach Nintendo's deadline. And according to senior artist James Dargy, quote, "I think it took us almost 6 months to do the first level that Nintendo approved, and then we had less than a year to do the rest of the game."
Oh, no.
So yeah, not a good time for crunch in the game industry. It still isn't a great time for it, but the people that did talk about it did not sound like great conditions. And yet the game they churned out, just amazing. Some fun trivia time. The PAL version of the game seems to have an opening voiced narration to it. I'm watching long plays and the like on YouTube. I'm like, what is this voice talking about? Oh, the adventures of Samus Aran. I'm like, no, I remember the game opening up with gorgeous shots of space and this MIDI orchestral score coming in. Like, what is this? So that was odd. Other voice acted elements were planned, but overall scrapped. It's a pretty quiet experience on the voice acting front, though instead, notable voice actress Jennifer Hale, who is credited as JH, gives Samus's grunts in the game, whether it's damage or landing or big jumps or things like that. Little sound effects there from Jennifer Hale. Notably, she is female Commander Shepard, and all of the many, many other roles that Jennifer Hale has done in her career. Some cut gameplay elements include a boss fight against Kraid in Phazon Mines. Some people think that he would have been what Omega Pirate was, and that was apparently said, no, that's not the case. He was just cut. They had some concept art for Mother Brain as well to show the sense of scale, but Mother Brain's not in the game. Also, the Speed Booster suit upgrade from Super Metroid was apparently planned to be in Metroid Prime, but this would have been really tough in a first-person perspective, and apparently with also the limitations of the environment scale.
Yeah, that sounds like it would be Motion Sickness City.
Yeah, just zoom, run, go, go, go. The screw attack was also apparently planned, but this would wait until the game's sequel to be first fully implemented. And here I am talking about Metroid Prime all this time, but we also have to talk about Metroid Fusion. Metroid Fusion was a Nintendo R&D1 developed Game Boy Advance game. It was the team's project that followed Wario Land 4, which we have mentioned recently and covered on the show. It is currently placed the latest in the Metroid canon chronology, and it is sometimes referred to as Metroid 4 because it is the spiritual successor to Super Metroid. More of the side-scrolling Metroidvania that Super Metroid was, just on Game Boy Advance. It was released the day after Metroid Prime in North America, on November 18th, 2002. If you're wondering, Metroid Fusion's music was composed by Minako Hamano and Akira Fujiwara, in case you're wondering where the other half of the Super Metroid tandem team of Kenji Yamamoto and Minako Hamano, what was she working on? Metroid Prime players could connect to Metroid Fusion with the GameCube and Game Boy Advance cable to receive Samus's Fusion suit that you could wear after you beat Metroid Prime for the first time. So there was a way that these two games could connect.
It's too bad the Fusion suit is ugly.
Yeah, with its cyan and yellow colors, some magenta in there. I think it's just not the best look.
Yeah, no, it sucks. It at least in Metroid Prime, it has the decency to be in first person, so you wouldn't have to look at it.
Yeah, not too often, unless you're saving, right? Overall, though, Metroid Prime, it's a great game to watch speedruns of. In the initial release of the game, because there are 5 versions of the GameCube game with different releases and patches and all that built into the disc. In the earliest initial release of the game, it was possible to reach a platform in the opening area of the game, which players were meant to backtrack and return to later, where you could get the space jump boots, or essentially double jump. And so getting this way earlier than you're supposed to causes a lot of sequence breaking. While most first playthroughs of Metroid Prime can range in the 15 to 20 hour range, any percent runs have a 1 hour 8 minute world record time, while 100% runs have a 1 hour 36 minute world record time. So always fun if you see that in an AGDQ or an SGDQ.
I don't think I've ever watched a speed run of Metroid Prime. I should look into that next GDQ.
It's so fun. There's one from a couple years ago where they got like one of the retro designers to watch in and have like developer commentary along with it. It was fantastic.
Those are always so entertaining.
So good. Metroid Prime is one of the best reviewed games of all time. Metacritic's review average score of 97 with 70 reviews puts it at the 18th best reviewed game on the platform of all time. It's the 12th highest scoring game if you take out platform duplicates. It is praised for its detailed graphics, special effects, varied environments, moody soundtrack and sound effects, level design, immersive atmosphere, and innovative gameplay centered on exploration, in contrast with action games at the time such as Halo, while staying faithful to the Metroid formula. Criticisms were honestly fair, included the unusual control scheme, thanks first-person game on a Nintendo GameCube controller, a lack of focus on the story. You can thank the scan visor for that, where you add plot elements there and you just bring up this visor and you scan things. It doesn't work so well for American players, but apparently Japanese players love the scan visor. And so it was Retro's goal to kind of like balance both in a way. And then repetitive backtracking. I think you can just thank Metroidvania as a genre for that one.
Yeah, it's just the genre. Yeah.
2 million copies were sold of Metroid Prime on the GameCube version, making it tied for the 7th bestseller on the platform. It won Game of the Year from multiple outlets, including GameSpot, GameSpy, Electronic Gaming Monthly, Nintendo Power, Edge, and the Game Developer's Choice Awards. It was nominated for 10 Interactive Achievement Awards. This is the awards show that would eventually become what we know as DICE, including nominated for Game of the Year and Original Music Composition. But it only won Console First-Person Action Game of the Year. Boy, that's kind of putting it into a niche genre there. I found it interesting that in 2004, the G4 video game countdown TV show Filter said that Metroid Prime had the best graphics of all time. Which, it looked great on the GameCube, but it's quite the stretch. And then there's also the headlines and articles that came out at the time where like, is Metroid Prime the Citizen Kane of gaming?
Yeah!
And it's like, if you're talking about it in those terms, boy, Metroid Prime must be quite a game. It's typically actually part of the, I would say, big four Nintendo GameCube games that typically jockey for top spots on like, what are the best GameCube games of all time? I mean, these would be Resident Evil 4, Metroid Prime, Super Smash Bros. Melee, and The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. You pick whatever order you want, but generally it's one of those four that tops the list, or they're in the top spots.
Yeah, those check out, far as I'm aware.
Yeah, absolutely. Metroid Prime's legacy. Well, it started a trilogy, followed by 2004's Metroid Prime 2 Echoes on GameCube, and 2007's Metroid Prime 3 Corruption on Nintendo Wii. Other Metroid games that would use the Prime name included 2005's Metroid Prime Pinball on Nintendo DS, 2006's Metroid Prime Hunters on Nintendo DS, which brought up some different bounty hunters, including Silex, who people think, oh, could he be a player in the future of the Metroid Prime series? We'll have to see, honestly. And then 2016's Metroid Prime Federation Force for Nintendo 3DS, which, yeah, I feel like that was a misuse of the Metroid Prime name.
It happened.
It was a game. Frigate Orpheon was a stage in Super Smash Bros. Brawl, with Metroid Prime's first boss, the Parasite Queen, kind of lurking and showing up in the background, and this Frigate Orpheon stage would eventually return to Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. And then at E3 2017, during the Nintendo Direct, the spotlight show there's music playing in the background. Blue clouds form the screw attack symbol, and then a 4 shows up. Metroid Prime 4, now in development for Nintendo Switch. It's almost been 4 years since that trailer. That game is currently in development hell.
Well, it started at Bandai Namco, if I remember correctly, and then got dropped by Bandai Namco and moved over back to Retro.
And they keep looking for an art director, and there's just a whole mess. It's honestly crazy. I went and watched a compilation of people reacting to that trailer, and I just want to point out, y'all fake fans out there who have to wait for the 4 to show up. Some people even like, what 4? What's this for? And have to wait for the title splash of Metroid Prime 4 to like start their freak out or whatever. No. It's the music immediately. And then maybe if you're lucky, if you couldn't hear the music well enough, it's the screw attack. Come on. Honestly, just a lot of disappointing reactions out there for Metroid Prime 4. As far as how you could play Metroid Prime today, could you play it on Nintendo Switch? Metroid Prime Trilogy on Nintendo Switch is one of those rumors that's out there, like everyone talks about it as if it's a thing and Nintendo's just waiting for the right time, and it's one of those should have happened by now rumors. We'll just have to wait and see and keep our fingers crossed, honestly.
Yeah, I've heard from multiple people that I know would partially be in the know that it is a thing, but they have no idea why it's not coming out. So
maybe they just want to wait until a little closer until Metroid Prime 4 is actually on its way. I don't know. That's definitely makes you wonder. So we hadn't brought Metroid Prime to the show for the longest time, even though I desperately wanted to, because we had covered Kenji Yamamoto in our Super Metroid episode. And, how could we cover other composers, whatever? Looking into it closer, though, Kenji Yamamoto had a music assistant for his composing efforts, and that is Kouichi Kyuma. So that's who we'll be highlighting today. Kouichi Kyuma was born in Fukuchiyama, Kyoto Prefecture in Japan. After he graduated from his time at university, he officially joined Nintendo in 2002, initially working as a sound engineer for the software planning and development division. He still seems to be with the company today. And that's all, folks. Sorry. Not much there on Kouichi Kyuma. He did some composing work as an assistant for Yamamoto on Metroid Prime, and then he composed for Photo Dojo, which was a DSi game. He eventually was a sound director for Jam with the Band, which I think was Daigaso Band Brothers DX. It's that game where Barbara the Bat, if that name rings a bell, the assist trophy from Super Smash Bros. It's that game. It was a DS game. I guess it was called Jam with the Band here in the West. Also sound director on Mario Tennis Aces. But then he was also a sound engineer on Electroplankton, The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker HD, Super Mario Maker, ARMS, Super Mario Maker 2, and New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe. So I don't know how much he got to assist. It seems like Kenji Yamamoto really composed the music, but had some assistance from Kouichi Kyuma. So, Kyuma we get to cover today as a new composer on the show. And apparently Yamamoto included some tracks on the soundtrack, which were arrangements of tracks from previous games in the series, because he wanted to satisfy old Metroid fans. Quote, "It's like a present for them." So, for example, when you step outside of Samus's gunship and you hear that initial Tallon overworld theme, where it's this kind of lush jungle, it's a reinterpretation of the original Metroid's Brinstar theme, with some of that melody kind of echoing in the background. Whereas in Magmore Caverns, more of the lava area on Tallon IV, it's definitely a more direct new version of the music from Super Metroid's Lower Norfair area. It's not the entire soundtrack that's like this, but certain tracks definitely pay direct homage to past Metroid tracks. The game supports Dolby Pro Logic 2 setups and can be played in surround sound. Quite the accomplishment, I think, for a GameCube game at the time in 2002. The official soundtrack release includes Metroid Fusion's soundtrack as well. It's kind of a joint release that released on its album form on June 18th, 2003. Found it interesting to learn that Tommy Tallarico did sound effect work for the game, but his studios were forgotten in the game's credits. Ooh. As their contract apparently ended up ceasing during development and kind of left Retro to seemingly pick up the pieces. We'll talk about Mr. Tallarico in a couple of weeks, but I just found that interesting to point out. So what are the 5 critical tracks for Metroid Prime? Well, I'm glad you asked. It wasn't an easy task to go through one of my favorite games and pick out the critical 5, but we'll have to start with the first critical track. This is Menu Select. This is the main menu theme of the game after you've pressed start on the title screen. The title screen has more of like a subdued kind of sci-fi effect. These kind of like digital noises effects in there. And like, yo, real fans, that's what's in the Metroid Prime 4 trailer. Real fans would know. But honestly, no, this menu select theme, like this is the theme of the game for Metroid Prime. As I said, like these kind of infectious sci-fi sound effects in there with just a powerful synth and choral melody going that really is an earworm. Joe, you may have heard this song as it was arranged, but honestly hardly remixed in Super Smash Bros. Brawl, where it was paired with a voiceover track during this opening kind of more undercurrent part where it had this voiceover of, in the reaches of space, below the surface of planet Zebes, Samus Aran faced the space pirates. She destroyed their operation, wiped out the parasites called Metroids, and defeated Mother Brain. But the pirates were far from finished. Which is a recap of the story of the first Metroid leading into Metroid Prime, where this menu select theme plays. Just a classic theme for the game. It had to be here. It would be a travesty to leave it off this list.
I mean, this is one of those people consider the menu of Metroid Prime to be one of the best menus of any game that has ever been, which is why people are usually sad about Trilogy. Because Trilogy doesn't have them.
Mm-hmm.
Including this one, which is my biggest disappointment of the fact that I'll be playing it on Trilogy. I still don't understand why they did that, too.
Mm-hmm.
Because, yeah, this is, if you've heard a song from Metroid Prime, it's probably this one.
Yeah, it's a classic, right? So I know a lot of people, especially in YouTube comments, saying like, oh, I just hung on the menu for as long as I could just to listen to this. I mean, it's not much of a menu in Metroid Prime, honestly, but some killer music to go along with it. But let's get to number 2 on their Critical 5. This is Tallon Overworld. So as I mentioned earlier, when you first step out onto Tallon Overworld, it's a song that kind of echoes the classic Brinstar theme from the original Metroid. But past a certain point in the game, Tallon Overworld, when you revisit it, in this kind of jungle-ish landscape, this becomes the music for this environment. And to me, this is Metroid Prime's in-game music vibe. You've got synths, you've got percussion, you have environmental noise going on, there's these digital sci-fi sound effects, there's choir, and even just these haunting melodies. Could not include it in the clip, but there's this whistle part that comes in, this doo-doo, doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. Like, it's, oh my gosh, it's just magical, I think, when you're exploring that environment, especially that one that you're returning to, that you're getting familiarity with Tallon IV. That this one is special. There are some tracks here in this game that are, legendary status, but to me, this is one of my favorites, and one that just kind of exemplifies the vibe during the game that this song, this soundtrack has going for it.
And it's interesting that you mentioned the vibe, because to me, this sounds very close to something that I would have heard with much lower quality of sound, obviously, in Super Metroid. Like, this feels like you can absolutely paint the line between point A to point B from Super Metroid to this song. It fits. You could put this in Super Metroid, and I believe that it was supposed to be there.
Definitely. I feel like, yeah, that's a good way of describing that. Kind of trying to capture that vibe, but we're in a new generation. We're in a new console. Like, the audio capabilities are expanded. Let's get to number 3 on the Critical 5, though. This is an interesting one, I guess. It is versus Space Pirates. Honestly, not one of the best pieces in the game. It's honestly pretty annoying, but it's probably the track that you're going to hear the most in the game, as it's almost like, if you want to take a comparison from Pokemon, it's almost like the wild battle theme against space pirate grunts that you hear in the world. So the map of Metroid Prime, like in Super Metroid, it's divided by all these doors, right? So it's these kind of areas that are connected by doors, and sometimes you get problems where doors take a while to open because it's trying to load the next area. Well, sometimes space pirates may be in that next room, and so if they are, this music kind of kicks in and is do 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 boom 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 boom, and so you're gonna hear it a lot when you're gonna have these different pirates that are kind of at these certain spawn points in the world. Again, not the best piece, but it's an important one that kind of defines the Metroid Prime experience, so that's why it's here in the critical tracks.
Well, that's also another one that feels like it belongs in Super Metroid, but this time not in a good way, because I feel like a couple of the boss themes in Super Metroid are kind of very similar in tone, of like this annoying, all right, yeah, I heard it already. Okay, cool. Yeah, let's go. All right, fine. But yeah, I could hear why this would get grating over many different encounters with the song.
Some MIDI instruments, not the best choices. Later in the piece, someone I think described it as, it's not in the clip, but it's like like it's almost an electric guitar sort of thing, but it's mixed and like kind of, it's just a different effects put on it to the point where like, oh, so Kenji Yamamoto wanted to emulate like a whale call, like in this. It's just some weird instrument choices there. But if we're talking like the realness, the real tracks, let's get to number 4 on the Critical 5. This is Phendrana Drift's Ice Valley. This is the game's best piece by far, and it is not even close. I think it is God tier up there when you're talking about what are the best snow or winter themes in all of gaming. When people put lists together like that, and Phendrana Drifts is up there at number 1 or the top. Like, yeah, they've got it right. So at this point, like, you've been through the jungle, you've gone through like the rocky Chozo ruins, you've gone through lava, and then you hit this snow world. And it's this beautiful piano and choir with this synth atmosphere, and that only gets better when the percussion gets added in, as you hear in the clip. And then at the end of the clip, I mean, my goodness, this incredible solo harp melodic run that just really gives you that feeling of snow falling. Like there's a kind of a mystical energy here, but it's in a winter environment. Just one of the very, very special tracks in this game.
So would you believe me if I told you that despite hearing this specific track talked about all the time as one of, if not the best song on this soundtrack, this is the first time I've ever actually heard it. I never went to seek it out. I don't know why. I think it's because it's another one of those casualties from, well, if I want to listen to the soundtrack, I want to play the game first, etc., which I've slowly broken out of over the past couple years. So I just never really went to listen to it. And yeah, it's good. It's really good.
Well, I'm glad it lives up to your expectations then. Yeah, it's a really special one. I'm surprised that it's only been really confined to Metroid Prime and not like, let's use it in other games like Smash Brothers. So I don't know if it would fit a fighting game aesthetic, but
I'm pretty sure the first time I ever heard this song's title was you mentioning it on early Show Your News as a song that needed to be in the game.
I mean, it's the piece. It's the best piece from Metroid Prime. So that does not surprise me to hear that my younger self said something like that. But we'll wrap up the Critical 5 with a track that did make it to Super Smash Bros. Brawl. And this is Versus Meta Ridley. This is for the penultimate boss fight. You've collected the 12 Chozo artifacts. You've opened up the impact crater, but someone wants to pay a little visit first. And that's Meta Ridley, who you saw in the beginning of the game. So this is, of course, based on Minako Hamano's classic boss battle theme for Ridley from Super Metroid. It's a hype theme to begin with. We even said so on the Super Metroid episode of Original Soundchat, but I think it's just improved even more with Metroid Prime's musical elements that you've now experienced thoroughly so far. It's a really neat touch to have like the original Super Nintendo synth runs in there. Like, I mean, then at the very end of the piece, not the clip, just classic Ridley riffs. Granted, I think future iterations, like I think Omega Ridley, did a nice, even more guitar amped up version of that theme, but for what Metroid Prime's overall vibe of the soundtrack is, like, this is a great track. And it was featured directly, no arrangement, no remix, but directly into Super Smash Bros. Brawl.
And it's always a really interesting one to think about because when you think of rearrangement of Versus Ridley, it's always metal. Mm-hmm. It's always metal. And then this one comes in and it's more sort of electronic and a little bit more low key almost.
Yeah.
And like, it just feels a little bit more sinister. And I think this might be among my favorite remixes of Versus Ridley like ever.
Yeah, it's definitely up there. It's one of the tracks that really stands out to me. And it was going on here no matter what. I don't care if we'd covered Versus Ridley before, but it's a perfect inclusion to kind of wrap up the Metroid Prime soundtrack, the Critical 5 here. But on the cutting room floor, had a couple more that I wanted to throw in here. The first of these is the downed frigate Orpheon. So you started on Frigate Orpheon in the game, but you returned to it as it has crashed on Tallon IV. The spaceship, the frigate, is now underwater. And so you get to explore the ship again, but in a different environment. But the water is oppressive here. And so this is where you get the gravity suit that allows you to move more freely in water. But the piece, it stands out. It's totally different because it's just this beautiful piano piece with still these sci-fi elements, these synths kind of just floating around in this ethereal vibe. But I mean, we talked about it. When you've got these gorgeous piano pieces, sometimes you just got to add them. And that's definitely the case with the downed frigate Orpheon.
Yeah, this is a really, really nice piece and definitely feels like an underwater level. Like it has that feeling.
Absolutely. The other one on the cutting room floor, it's more of a troll bit from me, but I had to include it. I'm sorry, Metroid Prime fans. It's versus Chozo Ghost. So this plays when you're fighting the difficult Chozo ghosts that, again, can spawn randomly when you're entering a room. The lights dim. This plays, you have to find the ghost with your X-ray visor while it's shooting at you. It's just a terribly frantic and honestly annoying piece. But you know it's here because it is a memorable part of the Metroid Prime experience. You know, call it what you will. Like, it's okay, it's grating, it's annoying, but everyone who's played Metroid Prime knows this theme. For one reason or another.
Frantic is a good description of it, though. Because, yeah, manic and frantic are probably the two words I'd use to describe this.
Yeah, so, you know, totally opposite ends of the spectrum. You get nice slow piano, and then just the chaos of Chozo Ghost. What will I never forget about Metroid Prime? I mean, I think the masterclass of turning a classically 2D franchise into this 3D first-person exploration game with Metroidvania bits intact, with encouraging, go find those energy tanks, those missile expansions, have these big boss moments, kind of lay out the course of finding these different items, these upgrades, and by the end of the game, you've really gone through this whole experience. It's a masterclass in that, in adapting, what was a 2D franchise to a 3D franchise that became its whole trilogy. I love this game. I'm so glad I finally got to bring it to the show, and I am getting an itch. I have so many games I need to play, for the rut that I've been in, but learning about Metroid Prime and certain things I didn't know before, it makes me want to play it again.
Maybe you can play it alongside us when we get to it for Smasher Pieces in like 6-7 months from now.
It's not a bad idea, honestly.
Meanwhile, yeah, I'm just excited to be able to play it, honestly.
Yeah.
Because, I didn't grow up with a GameCube, obviously. I had a PlayStation 2 at that time. So Metroid Prime is one of those games that just, completely missed me. Even now that I do have access to a GameCube through borrowing it from my roommate, he owns Metroid Prime somewhere, but I mean, I've had it on Wii U and I just haven't loaded it up. So I'm looking forward to having an excuse that forces me to play.
I am really, really excited for you. So when it comes to games with these female protagonists and exploring lost civilizations, space civilizations, I mean, an interesting pairing with Heaven's Vault and Metroid Prime, but, very different soundtracks, but the quality is there regardless. And that will do it for us this week on Original Soundchat. You can find me on Twitter at Pete Speakeasy. Joe is over at The Dobaga. The video version of the show is on the Rhymes with Asia YouTube channel, but it's that MP3 podcast version that you want, hosted by Anonymous Dinosaur at anondino.squarespace.com. It's where Joe's other podcast, Smasherpieces, is hosted, and you can find original Soundchat and Smasherpieces over at podcast services all around the globe, wherever you get your podcasts, including on Spotify, where we have a feed of our episodes, but we also have a big Spotify playlist, where if we talk about a video game song on the show, or if it gets added to Spotify, like the tracks we've talked about before, they're getting added to that Spotify playlist. So Joe, Bravely Default, getting added to the Spotify playlist, but what else is getting added from this week?
Well, obviously Metroid Prime is not on Spotify because Nintendo, but Heaven's Vault is on Spotify, so that will be making its way on alongside Bravely Default.
Perfect. And when you're done listening, you can find us on social media at Soundchat OST. Leave some feedback for us. How are we doing? Also, leave us some suggestions for games you'd like us to cover in the future. We've had some of those lately, and that's great because that's one of our big efforts for 2021 is covering more of these games that you want us to cover. We're still working on merch. Those that'll be happening soon, getting our merch site established, as well as some bonus tracks coming your way. Joe, who are we talking about next week?
I will be talking about Richard Jacques.
And I will be talking about Daiki Kasho. That should also be an interesting one to finally get to. So to play us out when talking about Metroid Prime, it was finally time to talk about Metroid Metal, which was a project that was established in 2003 from the guitarist known as Stemage. And Stemage's real name is Grant Henry. Since then, he has worked with Ivy and Surashu on Steven Universe. So, I mean, he's continued to do great things. But Stemage's Metroid Metal project over at MetroidMetal.com has so many great metal covers of Metroid songs just there available to download. And one of these is, of course, Phendrana Drifts, a great cover, a metal cover of this gorgeous piece. And I thoroughly enjoy it. Thank you so much for listening this week on Original Sound Chat. We'll see you next time. Take care.